I'm Tom Shelton, Executive Director of the Kentucky Association of School Superintendents. As an educator, I understand the pressures you face in your schoolhouse, and I know it's not easy. And yet, at our core are both legal and ethical commitments to serve our children and youth, which is what Senate Bill 119 is all about. We are all aware of the legal responsibility every citizen in Kentucky has to report suspected child abuse and neglect. Senate Bill 119, which passed the Kentucky General Assembly in 2015, ensures that public school personnel in the Commonwealth can meet and exceed that ethical and legal responsibility by receiving important information about how to recognize child abuse and neglect. And that is a good thing. Kentucky children and youth spend a lot of time with us, and we all need to be equipped to recognize child abuse and know how to effectively intervene. Yes, I know your plate is filled with demands and responsibilities, but keeping every Kentucky public school student safe from abuse and neglect simply has to top our list of professional commitments to make a real difference for children and youth.
I'm Dwayne Westmoreland, Director of Case Advocacy and Youth Engagement at Kentucky Youth Advocates. First, as a grandfather, I thank Kosair Charities for leading this community in the challenge to eradicate child abuse by 2023. Every day, Kosair Charities is there when it comes to kids. The key to eliminating child abuse takes the commitment and involvement of everyone. That includes preachers, pediatricians, educators, parents, nonprofit professionals, early childhood providers, and many others. That includes you, and it includes me. It is tempting and frankly a lot easier to think that fighting child abuse is someone else's job. As someone who's spent 3 decades as a public school educator, I know you have multiple pressures with high-stakes testing and lesson plans. I also know you take daily steps to protect the children and youth that you teach. And we thank you for that. Part of that protection of your students means making sure you know how to recognize and report suspected child abuse and neglect. So I am asking you to reach deep, think creatively, and place ending child abuse at the top of your professional commitments. Can there be any other truer way to honor our professional code of ethics?
Hello, my name is Lucy Estel, and I'm the manager of the Child Protection Branch in the Division of Protection and Permanency, which is in the Department for Community-Based Services, or you may hear it referred to as DCBS. This training was developed to help you recognize and report child abuse and neglect. So let's get started. These are the basic definitions of abuse, neglect, and dependency. Physical abuse is non-accidental physical injury. Sexual abuse or exploitation is the use of the child for purposes of sexual stimulation, use of the child to engage in acts of prostitution, obscene or pornographic material. Neglect is the failure to provide essential protection, care, supervision, food, clothing, shelter, education, or medical care necessary for the child's health and safety, considering the child's age. Dependency means the child is without essential protection or care, not due to abuse or neglect. Human trafficking is when a child is subjected to engage in sexual acts or labor services in exchange for something of value, such as drugs, money, or shelter. Please note that human trafficking allegations are also investigated when the alleged perpetrator is not in a caretaking role of the child. Other agencies will be talking to you about how to recognize child physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, as well as neglect. Remember, if you are suspicious of abuse or neglect, report it. The indicators presented to you provide information as to what might be a trigger for you to make a report. Even if the child does not make a disclosure or if the child's explanation does not coincide with what you observe. I do want to highlight some indicators of human trafficking and emotional injury in this video, while the other presenters will discuss the other forms of abuse and neglect. Some human trafficking indicators include unexplained truancy, or a child is not enrolled in school, multiple runaway incidents with no explanation as to where the child was, references to frequent travel to other places, tattoos or branding, inappropriately dressed or dressed provocatively, sudden change in attire or possessions, including expensive jewelry, clothes, or accessories, A victim may have a boyfriend who is noticeably older. They may have multiple cell phones or multiple forms of IDs or fake IDs, access to one or more hotel key cards, or they may move frequently either in the state or out of state. The child may not know what city, state, or community they're currently in, or there may be inconsistencies in their story. Some physical indicators of emotional injury include bedwetting or soiling, frequent psychosomatic complaints such as a headache or abdominal pain. The child may not have attained significant developmental milestones. Some behavioral indicators include desperately seeks affection, loss of self-confidence or self-esteem, social withdrawal or loss of interest, decrease in school performance or loss of interest, or depression. Some caregiver indicators are unusually harsh or critical of the child, calls the child names or belittles the child, unrealistic expectations, or involves the child in adult situations or attempts to sabotage child's relationship with another caretaker. Kentucky state law is listed in Kentucky Revised Statute, or KRS 620.030. It states that anyone with a reasonable suspicion of child abuse, neglect, or dependency is required to make a report. Reports can be made to DCBS, law enforcement, the Commonwealth's attorney, or county attorney. It is best to make the report to DCBS unless it's an immediate safety issue, because we have the infrastructure in place to determine acceptance criteria and respond to reports across the state. KRS also states that failure to report could result in criminal charges. Everyone is a mandated reporter regardless of your professional capacity. KRS states that any person who has a reasonable cause to believe that abuse or neglect has occurred is a mandated reporter. There is a legal protection in KRS for reporting sources. It states that anyone acting upon reasonable cause to make a report has good faith immunity from liability, civil or criminal charges. This also covers if court action results from the report. Regarding confidentiality, KRS discusses that the reporting source's identity cannot be disclosed to anyone except law enforcement officials with a legitimate interest in the case, members of multidisciplinary teams, or under a court order after the court has conducted an in-camera review of the record of the state related to the report and has found reasonable cause to believe that the reporter knowingly made a false report. So how should you make a report of abuse or neglect? DCBS has 9 regional centralized intake units that take reports of suspected abuse and neglect during regular business hours. Or you may visit our website. You may also make a report during regular business hours by completing the reporting form on the online reporting portal, which is also on our website. And please note, this is for non-emergency reports. If you need to report suspected abuse or neglect after regular business hours, which would include nights, weekends, or holidays, you may contact the statewide abuse hotline at 877-597-2331. So what information do you need to provide when making a report to DCBS? Report only what you hear or see. Do not try to interpret or paraphrase the child's statement. Do not add to or take away parts of the disclosure you feel are not important. Provide objective information. Provide as much information as you can about the family, such as their contact information, last known addresses, or where the child attends school. Also, if there are weapons suspected in the home. This will assist the worker in locating the family quickly. If you hear a disclosure, witness an incident of maltreatment, or if you receive the information secondhand, at that moment you become obligated under state law to make a report. You may ask follow-up questions, however, do not attempt to interview the individual or conduct your own investigation. KRS states that other persons do not have the authority to conduct internal investigations in lieu of the official investigations outlined in this section. Questions that you will be asked when making a report to DCBS include: what is your name and relationship to the child or situation? What happened? Provide specific information regarding concerns and extent of the abuse, neglect, or dependency. What is the current location of the child? What is the current condition of the child? Do you have any knowledge of previous child abuse or neglect issues? Are there any immediate safety issues for the child or investigator? If there are weapons, vicious dogs, active meth lab, or other safety hazards, please include that information in your report. What information do you have regarding the perpetrator, such as their name or relationship to the child, or their whereabouts? After DCBS receives the report of suspected abuse or neglect, the intake worker screens the information provided by the reporting source. The 5 screening options for reports are meets acceptance criteria, which means that an investigator will be assigned. Does not meet acceptance criteria means that an investigator will not be assigned and no further action will be taken by DCBS. Resource link means the report does not meet acceptance criteria, but the intake worker links the reporting source to a community resource, such as community action, a medical provider, the court, or a counselor. Insufficient information means that there is not sufficient information provided to properly screen the report. And a law enforcement assist is a report that does not meet the cabinet's acceptance criteria, but the report is referred to law enforcement, and an investigative worker will assist law enforcement with their investigation. So why doesn't DCBS accept certain reports? Reports are not accepted when the situation does not meet the definition of abuse, neglect, or dependency, or if the injury is a result of an accident. Remember, DCBS does not have statutory authority to investigate accidental injuries. What happens next? If a report is accepted for investigation, social workers have a required time frame stated in Kentucky Administrative Regulation in which they have to make face-to-face contact with the victim. If the report alleges imminent safety risks, such as sexual abuse, human trafficking, or serious physical abuse or neglect, the initiation time frame is 1 hour. If the report alleges non-imminent risk, physical abuse, or neglect, the initiation time frame is 24 hours. Or if the report alleges a low-risk incident, the worker has 48 hours to initiate the report. These timeframes do include weekends and holidays. DCBS does have a policy regarding notification to school staff. Workers are required to conduct face-to-face interviews with school personnel within 2 working days when school is in session and the child is of school age. And workers are also required to notify the school within 2 working days of the conclusion of the agency's work with the family if school is in session. It is possible that you could be called to court as a witness based on your observation of the incident or the family. The takeaway from the training is that everyone is a mandated reporter. Remember, if you are suspicious of abuse or neglect, report it. The Kentucky Child Abuse Hotline number is 877-597-2331, and our web address is www.chfs.ky.gov.
My name is Dr. Melissa Currie. I'm a child abuse pediatrician, medical director, and chief of the Kosair Charities Division of Pediatric Forensic Medicine at University of Louisville. Child maltreatment occurs in all social, economic, and ethnic groups. It can and does happen in quote-unquote nice families. Photographs are really important, especially for child abuse pediatricians and investigators. So, when possible, help facilitate photographs being taken. If that's not possible in the school setting, letting the social workers with CPS know that photographs are necessary can be helpful. The rest of the presentation includes some photographs that may be disturbing to some viewers. Let's start with a case example. Let's say you're walking down the hall and you see a 9th grader in a tank top. And behind the tank top and up above it on his neck, you can see some of the marks below in the photograph that are visible. What do you do? Well, the first thing that we should do is ask the child what happened. Oftentimes we're reluctant to actually ask direct questions of children in whom we see injuries, and it really is okay to do that. We want to take the child to a private area, though. This wouldn't be a question to ask in front of other kids. The question should be asked in a non-threatening way so that the child doesn't feel like they're in trouble. Let's say you ask and he looks at the floor and says, "I fell off my bike this weekend." Well, Based on his demeanor, you can decide whether you want to continue to ask more questions or if you want to just stop there and go ahead and make a report. As you can see in this picture, these are pattern injuries, which I will talk more about a little bit later. But these are not injuries that would be consistent with falling off a bike. This is an injury that needs to be reported to DCBS. DCBS is called the Department of Community-Based Services. That's what we call Child Protective Services, or CPS, here in Kentucky. For the rest of the presentation, I'll be referring to that state organization as CPS. These are pictures of loop marks. Loop marks are the injury that's left behind anytime a child is struck violently with a thin, flexible object that can conform to the contours of the body. This can include belts, cords, extension cords, wire coat hangers, basically anything that can conform to those curves. So you can see multiple examples of loop marks here on the screen. On the far left, you can see multiple loop marks on the arm of a child. You can see that that would be an area of the body that would be visible to educators in a school setting. Often the question arises about physical punishment and spanking. We know that physical punishment is indeed legal in the United States, so at what point does it become child abuse? Well, essentially, it boils down to whether or not injury occurs. We are allowed to physically discipline children, but we are not allowed to leave injury as a result. So if we are seeing bruises or any other kind of injury as a result of physical punishment, that needs to be reported to Child Protective Services. How can we not miss abuse? Well, the first thing is to simply consider the possibility in all of the kids that we see who have either injuries or new behaviors or frequent absences from school, anything that might make us concerned about that child's well-being. Simply having it on our mind as a possibility is the first and most important step to not missing this phenomenon. Asking for explanations from children when we see injuries, keeping it subtle, low-key, but also private. Photographs are really important, especially for child abuse pediatricians and investigators. So, when possible, help facilitate photographs being taken. If that's not possible in the school setting, letting the social workers with CPS know that photographs are necessary can be helpful. And then finally, keeping written documentation of all interactions with children around questions regarding their injuries. This includes both the questions we ask of the children and the answers that they give us, as close to word for word as possible. It turns out that contusions are one of the most common and easily overlooked early warning signs of abuse. They're also one of the most easily recognizable if we learn to look for the right things. Basically, bruises or contusions are just bleeding beneath intact skin, and that can be caused by a number of different kinds of blunt force. That can be from a direct impact. It can also be by continuously applied pressure like squeezing or pinching. The 10-4 bruising rule was developed here in Louisville, Kentucky to help us know which kinds of bruises we need to have concerns about when it comes to child safety. TEN stands for torso, ears, and neck. Any bruising of the torso, ears, or neck in a young child is very concerning for abuse and needs to be reported. When it comes to older children, there's some variation in the rule, but essentially neck and ear bruising is still a very rare accidental finding in older students. The last part of the rule has to do with babies, and as we know, in our high school population, some of them have already become parents. So simply educating high school students that bruising in babies is never normal can go a long way to preventing child abuse escalation. Here are some photographs of bruises to the ear. This just is an example that many different parts of the ear can be affected. The bruises can be single or multiple, different sizes, different colors. Essentially, though, ear bruising is very, very rare from accidental injury and needs to be reported. Here are two examples of neck bruising. While these photographs are of younger children, neck bruising is one of the most common locations where we see inflicted bruising in older children. This often occurs in the course of a physical assault with attempted strangulation. Here's an example of a patterned injury in a younger child, although this is a pattern that we see in older children as well. This is a slap mark. This child was presented for medical care with the history that he had run into a wall, but in fact, these are the marks that are left behind when there is a violent impact with an open hand, and this diagram helps show how that happens. You see the bruises between the fingers, and that gives it the stripe-like appearance. And as I mentioned before, this is seen in older children as well. This is an injury that we can see in both young and old children, but it tends to be more in older children and can be associated with sexual assaults as well as physical assaults. These are called subconjunctival hemorrhages, and it's essentially bleeding right on top of the white part of the eye. And this comes with attempted strangulation or any time a child is unable to breathe properly. One myth that is commonly perpetuated in the media and in other places is this idea that bruises can be dated. It's really helpful to avoid any attempts to say whether a bruise is old or new when talking with investigators, because it turns out that we really don't have the scientific basis to make those statements. So if we're describing bruises to investigators or we're calling the CPS hotline, it's helpful to talk about the size of the bruises, their color, their location, their shape, but don't attempt to give an age for the bruise. There are a lot of contributors to child maltreatment. The most common of those include domestic violence in the family, a criminal history among adults in the home, and substance abuse. Untreated and undiagnosed mental illness is a very close fourth. But one of the most common threads that we see in so many families where there's child maltreatment is the idea of having unrealistic expectations for the child's age and developmental ability. This applies to teenagers every bit as much as it does to younger children, because teenagers are still actively developing their brain. They still have that impulsivity and emotionalism that can make it very difficult for parents, especially parents who have other stresses in the home as well. Things to look for in children as early warning signs of child maltreatment can include children who come to school with injuries, whether they seem to constantly be injured or they sometimes come to school with multiple injuries, especially if injuries are unexplained or if they involve the 10-4 region. Children or adolescents who wear long sleeves or turtlenecks, basically clothing that's inappropriate for the weather. This is often done to cover up injuries on the arms and on the neck. And of course, in addition to inflicted injury by a caregiver, this can also be an indicator of self-harm. It can be an indicator of human trafficking and or intimate partner violence. Those who are stealing food or falling asleep in class may have food insecurity or housing insecurity. They may not have a place to sleep regularly at home and may be living in chaotic home environments. So those can be indicators of neglect as well as truancy. And then also a fall in grades or behavior issues. Now, obviously, when these things come up, they can be an indicator of child maltreatment. They can also be an indicator of a coexisting mental illness, either on its own or coexisting with trauma. And then finally, there's the phenomenon of having a new adult living in the home. This is a particularly high-risk time for both children and adolescents. This can include when a parent has newly gotten out of prison. It can be when a parent has recently redeployed from being overseas for a military deployment, or if one or the other parent has a new romantic partner that has moved into the home. All of those are high-risk times when it's important to keep a closer eye on our kids. Other red flags can include if a child has a history of being drug affected as an infant. This can affect, even as an adolescent, the bond with the parents and the caregivers. Knowing that an adolescent has siblings that don't live in the home. That may be for reasonable family reasons, but it may also be because Child Protective Services has had previous involvement with the family and has removed other children from the home. Those adolescents who have multiple addresses or who move frequently, who have new behaviors such as aggression toward themselves or toward others, or if they're newly withdrawn when they used to be outgoing, all can be concerning signs of a change or stressful situation at home. One question that we are asked commonly is how to distinguish between neglect and poverty. And in truth, sometimes we can't on our own. We need the help of Child Protective Services to investigate the home environment and the family situation to help us understand. But essentially, this can be a real challenge at times. But here are some rules of thumb to keep in mind. If we have an adolescent that has extremely poor hygiene, for example, if that hygiene issue is affecting his or her ability to make friends and have normal social function in school because other kids don't want to be close to that child, that's affecting the child's normal function and needs to be reported. That doesn't necessarily mean it's due to neglect. It may be a poverty-related issue. Often, if the children's hygiene or clothing is in line with or similar to that of others in the home, and particularly the parents, we tend to be more concerned about poverty issues rather than neglect. On the flip side, if the children have poor hygiene or have very poor clothing, yet the adults are well cared for, that makes us much more concerned about the potential for neglect. Either way, Child Protective Services can put services in the home or make things available for the family to assist with these situations. We often hear from educators in particular that they have a hesitancy to call Child Protective Services for these kinds of issues because they don't want to be perceived as making an accusation of neglect or abuse for that matter. It really is helpful for all of us to remember that Child Protective Services is here to assist children and their families, and that can include providing resources and actually helping keep that family together when they otherwise may not have been able to sustain themselves. There is research that shows us that there are certain groups of children in whom we're more likely to overlook the early warning signs of abuse. This includes Caucasian children and families, those who we perceive to be similar to our own, families that are described as quote-unquote intact, meaning the mother and father live together in the home with the child, and middle-class, well-educated families. This is a very important issue for us to be aware of because it tells us that all of us have intrinsic biases about which families and which children get our attention when it comes to abuse, and we need to remember that it happens in all groups. When it comes to talking to kids about their injuries or about their home life, it's perfectly okay, as I mentioned before, to ask questions about how their injury occurred. We just don't want to ask leading questions. Leading questions are those questions that suggest that you want a particular answer. And I have some examples of safe, non-leading questions coming up. We also want to document the child's answers to those questions in addition to exactly how we asked it, so as close to word for word as possible. But here is probably one of the most important things we can do as educators. When talking with an adolescent about their home life or about injuries, simply letting them know that you care and that you are available for them should they decide at a later time that they have something they want to talk with you about can be a critical moment in a child's life. Research on resiliency in children who have experienced adverse childhood experiences shows that having an adult in their life who was constantly present and who would care made a big difference in those children being able to bounce back from their negative experiences. And that adult did not have to be the same person year after year. So it may have been a coach one year, a teacher the next year. So please know that your ability to help support a child who may be going through a rough time at home is very powerful just in letting them know that you care. Here are some examples of safe or non-leading questions. These are open-ended questions that don't give any suggestion about what kinds of answers you want to hear. Do you feel safe at home is one of my favorite ones. Kindness and rapport with adults, I think, can be a little bit difficult for many of us who work with children, especially if we have formed a bond with an individual child and we're worried that their adults are not doing what they need to do to keep the child safe. Although it can be tempting to be hostile or somewhat condescending or aggressive when talking with adults or parents, I think it can be very helpful to remember that it never hurts to be nice to a perpetrator, but we can do irreversible harm by being rude or accusatory of someone who hasn't done anything to hurt their child. Benign curiosity when we're talking with parents, simply seeking to understand where they're coming from and how the situation has come to be, can be helpful. Nothing is gained by being confrontational, accusatory, or judgmental. When it comes to reporting, here in the state of Kentucky, any person who has a reasonable suspicion that child maltreatment has occurred is required by law to make a report to Child Protective Services. The number to call is on your screen. When it comes to reporting, if we call the hotline, we're allowed to actually make a report anonymously. However, I would strongly encourage you to identify yourself both by name and as an educator calling from the child's school, because this brings with it a certain degree of credibility. When you call, they are going to want to know the child's name, address, where they can find the child, and then the specifics of why you're concerned. If you are concerned for the child's life, say so. Not all calls bring the same degree of concern, and it's important for the hotline to understand how concerned you are. Also, if you happen to be aware of younger siblings in the home that could potentially be at risk, that can be helpful to mention as well. Making the call to the hotline in a school setting sometimes poses an administrative dilemma. Oftentimes, the administrator in the school wants to be the one to make the call because they need to be in the loop and understand what is said. In the meantime, the teacher or some other staff member is the one with the first-hand information, who has either spoken directly to the child and or seen the injury themselves. The best solution to this is simply to have both the teacher and the administrator make the call together on speakerphone so that they're both contributing their part. It is absolutely critical for Child Protective Services to hear directly from the person who actually saw or heard the things that were causing the concern. Other things that you can do when making a call to the hotline is to ask the hotline to read back to you what they have recorded about your report. This will help ensure that they capture all the details that you have provided about why you're concerned about this child's safety. Write down the name of the hotline worker and also the intake ID, and then give them your contact info so that they can contact you after the investigation and ask follow-up questions. So take-home messages include that linear and other pattern bruising is very common and often overlooked in children and adolescents. Remember the 10-4 bruising rule. Although it was developed for younger children, it has components that are applicable to older children and adolescents as well. Remember that bruises can't be dated, but that photographs are very helpful in the medical assessment of child maltreatment. Be kind and respectful when speaking with families. Also, it's okay to speak directly to the child and ask open-ended questions. Just make sure to document clearly both what questions you asked and what the child answered.
I'm Pam Darnall, President and CEO of Family and Children's Place. While not all children who exhibit these behaviors or traits have been sexually abused, there are some common behavioral indicators. Difficulty concentrating or staying on task, agitation and irritability are common. Lacking motivation and showing little or no emotion may also be signs of sexual abuse. Unexplained episodes of anger, rage, or moodiness may occur. A child who has been sexually abused may make strong efforts to avoid or to be with a specific person without an obvious reason. Behaviors such as not wanting to change clothes in front of others or participate in physical activities may be other indicators of abuse. Being consistently dirty, lacking sufficient clothing, or begging for money or food may also be indicative of sexual abuse. Sudden changes in behavior may occur, such as becoming more withdrawn from normal or routine activities, being more aggressive toward family, friends, pets, or toys, or unexpected changes in school performance. The child may start coming to school or activities early, staying late, or not wanting to go home at all. Sometimes children experiencing sexual abuse assume more of a parental role with younger siblings, often as a protective measure. Play may be absent or may be violent, or the child may engage in play persistent with sexual themes. The child may express feelings of hopelessness or depression, or self-hatred, or may actually harm themselves or attempt suicide. Some children experience nightmares and sleep disturbances and may regress to bedwetting and other behaviors too young for their current developmental level. Older children may develop substance abuse problems, have eating disorders, or may run away from home. Another indicator is when a child displays knowledge or interest in sexual acts that are inappropriate to his or her age, excessive masturbation, or even displaying seductive behavior. Physical indicators may include unexplained injuries, pain when toileting, and trouble walking or sitting. Pain, itching, bleeding, or bruising in or around the genitals, or a sexually transmitted disease or pregnancy, especially under the age of 14, are all red flags. Sometimes a parent's demeanor or behavior sends red flags about child abuse. Warning signs include parents or caregivers who do not provide adequate adult supervision or who are emotionally absent. These parents or caregivers often isolate the child from others, including peers. They may show little concern for the child, seem unable to recognize physical or emotional distress in the child, and may offer conflicting or unconvincing explanations for a child's injuries. If staff or teachers see these adult behaviors, they would want to consider if they have observed any of the other indicators already mentioned. If several indicators, along with these parent or caregiver behaviors, have been observed, the staff would want to consider calling Child Protective Services. If a child discloses abuse, it is critical for you to stay calm, listen carefully, and be a source of safety and support. Manage your own emotions and do not overreact or underreact. Be aware of what your tone of voice, body posture, and expressions may be communicating. The child needs you to be the adult, to be in control, and to provide safety. How you respond will influence what the child chooses to tell other people about the situation. Allow the child to share at his or her own pace, using his or her own language. Do not press the child for details. Do not make remarks that question the child's experience or even confirm the experience. Just let the story unfold. Use your own experience to help you understand what the child may be feeling, such as fear, hopelessness, shame, or guilt. It is okay to ask feeling-oriented questions that allow the child to share their experience safely without asking specific questions about details. You may make supportive comments such as, "I'm sorry that happened to you. I understand what you are saying. That must have been difficult for you. I can understand how you might have felt afraid, or confused, or angry. How did you feel? How do you feel now? You sound like you feel angry, sad, confused, or scared. You look angry, sad, or confused." It's okay to feel angry, sad, or confused. Assure the child that their feelings are okay. Most importantly, assure the child this is not their fault. Thank the child for telling you and reassure him or her of your support. Do not promise to keep something just between you and the child. Do not ask for additional details about who, what, when, where, or how. That is the job of the investigators. Do not try to sort out what is true or make discounting statements such as, "Are you sure you did not misunderstand?" or "He or she would not have done that. You are wrong." Or, "That isn't that bad. It could have been worse." Your job is simply to listen to the child. Call in the report immediately, document your actions, and follow the policies and procedures of your school.
Anytime we're talking about adolescence, it's important to at least mention the phenomenon of human trafficking. This can affect both girls and boys, and the trafficker, also known as the pimp, is often identified by the adolescent as a romantic partner. So that is one reason that human trafficking is so challenging, is because the victim does not see himself or herself as a victim. And that can be very difficult in helping to identify this sort of exploitation. Truancy is very common in these adolescents, as are physical injuries, and those injuries may be inflicted both by the John or by the pimp. Either way, these children are at high risk of serious physical injuries and many times have been taken to emergency departments and other medical providers for care. The dynamic can be very challenging because it tends to be a complex combination of intimate partner violence and sexual exploitation. If you are concerned about trafficking in an adolescent, report to the CPS hotline. We have legislation in place here in Kentucky to help address it.
Thanks for watching. For additional resources and information on how to be a face that ends child abuse, visit www.faceatabuse.org.